Hello everyone, and welcome to The Fields. Our sponsor this episode is 314 Garden Supply in Florissant, Missouri. Whatever your gardening style, anything grows at 314 Garden Supply. Do you garden in a raised bed? 314 has the organic or living soil that you need. Do you prefer to grow hydroponically? 314 has the mediums and nutrients you need. No matter your style, Mary and her team at 314 Garden Supply offer the knowledge and products and classes to get you gardening with vigor. 314 Garden Supply in Florissant, Missouri. Here to help you discover your green thumb. Today's episode was recorded over Google Meet.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Fields. My guest today is an assistant scientist at Legacy Research Institute in Portland, Oregon. She has a background in pharmacology and neuroscience and is co-author of the study, The Nose Knows. Please welcome Dr. Adie Rae. Doctor, thank you so much for being on The Fields.
A sincere pleasure, Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, the official title is The Nose Knows Aroma But Not THC Mediates the Subjective Effects of Smoked and Vaporized Cannabis Flower. That's a mouthful. What are subjective effects?
Subjective is what the person feels themselves, right? If you think about objective effects, those could be things that we could measure from an outside perspective. So a field sobriety test is a perfect example of an objective effect of alcohol, for example. Whereas subjective effects are the things that people feel themselves inside their own brains and bodies.
Okay. Why did your team choose to focus on commercially available cannabis instead of the stuff that was provided by the National Institute of Drug Abuse?
Well, that's a great question. I guess I should start by saying, the paper and the research itself is really simply a byproduct of a community event, right? It is the byproduct of a cannabis competition. It wasn't intended to be a research project at all. It just happened to be an anonymous data set that we could turn into a research paper. So, of course, we're primarily interested in what's happening out there in the real world. And we know from, several previous studies that the kinds of cannabis that are produced for research by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA, that cannabis bears very little resemblance, either chemically or genetically, to all the diversity of cultivars that are available in commercially available markets. So one of the primary questions is, okay, how much do these things have in common with the cannabis that's available from NIDA? They have shown, time and again through very elegant experiments that, there's no dose-dependent relationship on, quote, drug effects when people consume NIDA cannabis, right? So if they take 1 hit or 2 hit or 6 hits, they don't like it anymore. They don't report wanting to use it anymore. But we weren't sure if that was also the case with commercially available cannabis out here in the real world. So it was really important that we, get at that foundational kind of question, how does commercially available cannabis make healthy adult people feel?
How were those cannabis samples selected?
Yeah, so this was people who volunteered to participate in a cannabis competition called the Cultivation Classic, which ran for a number of years here based in Portland, Oregon. And the folks who entered the competition were all organic cannabis farmers. And organic is kind of a loaded word, and it has a different federal meaning than it does, in practice. But essentially, if you were cultivating cannabis mindfully without, synthetic mineral fertilizers, that pretty much was the requirement for entering some flower into the competition. And so we looked at data from 2 years of these competitions, and there was a really diverse number of flowers that were in the cup. So we had mostly type 1 flowers, so those are THC dominant flowers. But especially in the second year of the cup, we had lots of hemp and hemp-like cultivars as well. Importantly, though, all of the folks who entered flower, they had to make sure that, it passed all of the safety requirements and had their, their compliance certificate of analysis first before we were able to accept it as a competitor.
What were some of the key subjective effects and desirability factors that were reported by the volunteers?
Yeah, so the things we custom built a survey for this purpose, right? So we essentially ran the competition as if it were a clinical trial. So that is, it was all double blind and the samples were randomized. So the folks who were judges for the competition, our volunteers, they didn't know what it was that they were consuming. And when we were analyzing their responses on the back end, we also didn't know what they had consumed. It was all, random 4-digit numbers that had been assigned to these different cultivars. And so when we developed a new tool for measuring how does cannabis make people feel, that tool was a lot different than what a lot of other cups have and continue to use as an assessment. Scale of 1 to 10, how good is this one? This is much more rigorous, in terms of using, really robust kind of psychometric tools to say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 7, a 7-point Likert scale, how desirable was the aroma? Overall, how desirable was the effect, right? The psychological effect. And then we also looked at a number of things like mood, right? So how happy did you feel and how relaxed did you feel? And so in the paper, we report, the small algorithm that we use to define sort of appeal or subjective enjoyment. And what it really was is, just a combination of how much did you like it and how good did you feel? How happy did you feel? So that's all the correlations and all the figures that you see in the paper are using that kind of score, that subjective appeal.
Okay. What do you think is the significance of the study's finding that consuming smaller amounts of cannabis led to a greater appeal? Don't Americans want bigger, better, stronger, faster?
Well, what's really interesting is that we've seen in other scientific papers that people tend to self-titrate their doses of cannabis. So basically what that means is that, especially for inhaled products, where you have an opportunity to take one hit or take another or not, for those kinds of inhaled products, what we see is that people very readily self-titrate. That is, they get to a point where they feel good and they stop. And so that we think is driving that effect where the vast majority of the people who consumed any sample in these competitions, they consumed the smallest amount possible. And we simply think that that's because, they consumed a small amount and they were happy. Are there folks in the competition who, used a half gram or a whole gram in a single session? A handful, but not very many.
How might this finding inform harm reduction strategies and public health messages?
Yeah, I think it speaks for itself, really, right? That we have this really, strong relationship between the people who use the smallest amounts of cannabis tend to get the most enjoyment out of it. Now, a lot of people aren't necessarily swayed by evidence. So that's kind of the problem, right? We've got a marketing problem or a sales problem, and the evidence is not a problem, right? We have the evidence to tell us that it makes a lot of sense that you can have everything you want while also not exposing yourself to levels of THC, which would cause unwanted effects or, even worse, harmful effects. So yeah, from a public health standpoint, it makes a lot of sense, but getting people to actually believe the evidence and getting people to actually, see what it's like to consume a small amount of cannabis or see what it's like to consume a low potency cultivar, right? We have deeply ingrained habits of what we think quality experiences or quality products are, and breaking those habits and asking someone to say, hey, try something you've never tried before. Trust me, I'm a scientist. We'll see.
Now, in the study's abstract, it says pleasant subjective aroma was positively correlated with pleasant subjective effects. But those subjective effects had nothing to do with THC percentage or dose or terpenes. Now, aren't terpenes what provide those wonderful aromas?
They certainly are, but terpenes are only one very small part of the aroma catalog, right? So if we talk about all of the volatile molecules that are in cannabis right now, you're lucky if you can buy a commercial cultivar that, the lab has tested for terpenes. But that's only a fraction of what's actually in the plant. We've got aldehydes, esters, ketones, volatile sulfur compounds, tons of other things that are also highly aromatic that nobody is talking about. And these are published in the scientific literature. For example, we know that skunk aromas are very largely produced by volatile sulfur compounds. If we look to the hops literature, those guys are doing crazy, very intense and complex aromatic chemistry in the hops world. And that's our closest agricultural cousin, right, to the cannabis plant. So there are a lot of lessons to be learned by looking at other agricultural commodities to say, okay, well, what's happening with the aroma over there in lavender production or in cacao or coffee? And we're just, this is a new industry and we're still figuring things out. And, the consumer, again, has an idea in their mind that a terpene flower is a good flower. And to some extent, yeah, a good smelling flower probably has some interesting terpenes in it, but it's not a one-to-one relationship, right? And so what our data suggests is that you don't even really necessarily need to look at the certificate of analysis. If it has passed compliance and it smells good to you, the THC percentage is irrelevant. Which terpenes are there are irrelevant. How many terpenes are there or the total terpene expression also irrelevant. What we found in our data was that a pleasant effect inside your brain is the most strongly related to a pleasant aroma.
Mind blowing. I feel like you just took years of schooling and threw it right out the window.
Yeah, and I mean, it can be a hard thing for a lot of folks, especially folks in the industry, to hear because they have spent sometimes millions of dollars investing in these, terp machines, for lack of a better word, right? Like they have really heavily bought into terpenes as being, the thing that's going to not only differentiate themselves in the marketplace, but provide a genuinely better experience for consumers. And that's simply not supported by our paper.
All right. I would like to switch to NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They're going to start including cannabis labeling requirements in one of its handbooks, things like milligrams per serving and defining hemp and cannabis based on their THC percentages. How would you envision NIST incorporating aroma assessment?
This is an excellent question. It's actually a research project that we have going on currently. So we're hoping to roll it out this harvest season. And for logistical purposes, we're focusing right now on hemp. But one of the things that we would love to see for both the consumer and for the entire supply chain is for folks to have an intelligent consensus way to talk about what aromas are in their products, right? So if a consumer walks into a dispensary or they're shopping for a CBD pre-roll online, they could say, I really love citrus aroma, right? And so right now, yeah, someone could probably put citrus on their packaging and kind of get away with it because there's no third party to validate that it is or isn't citrus, right? But wouldn't it be nice if we had a system, right? Somewhat akin to those flavor wheels that you see for coffee and beer and other products, but a really rigorous one that was, developed using real sensory scientists and trained sensory analysts to say, these are all the aromas that are out there, and these are the particular aromas that are in this product. So in that way, we'll have a collective, non-proprietary system for folks to communicate the features of their product.
Well, how can policymakers and industry stakeholders get together and do this? What's it going to take?
You could start by donating to the Oregon State University the Global Hemp Innovation Center. So this is one of the only places on earth where we get to do, some of these kinds of research. I think that we're now at the point where our institutional review boards who are approving human research, projects, they're finally okay with sticking their toes in the hemp and cannabis world. A lot of the sort of institutional hesitancy around doing cannabis research is finally starting to relax. And my collaborators at OSU are fantastic professional scientists. It's been really wonderful working with them. So I think that we're going to see a lot of really exciting research emerge from there. But of course, all research requires funding, right? There are highly trained people with finely tuned instruments and all that stuff. Right now, there's no federal bucket of money to get research grants from to do this kind of work. So we have to get very creative about the ways that we do support this kind of work. Federal legalization might change that, but that's crystal ball territory.
What do you think some challenges are in deciphering the interactions between the compounds in cannabis and their effects on the human experience?
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting question. So I think there are a number of things that make it very difficult. Number one, if we're talking about subjective effects, that is, and pardon me for sounding kind of glib, but it's subjective. It depends on the person,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's just like, a lot of my research is focused on pain and relieving pain. And everyone's pain is different. And there's no way for me to know what your knee pain feels like. And there's no way for you to know what my shoulder pain feels like, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the first difficulty, is that, when we're trying to describe an altered state of consciousness or perception, it's really difficult to sort of systematize. So that's one of our challenges. There are other challenges, of course, the fact that the plant itself has all these, there's so much polypharmacy happening. How these different molecules interact with one another has not been characterized. And, like all other parts of pharmacology, the effects differ depending on the doses. We see all the time in almost every receptor system I've ever studied, where a molecule does one thing at a low dose, another thing in a moderate dose, and then it goes back to the first thing at a high dose, right? So we have these biphasic effects.
Mm-hmm.
Of the cannabinoids are particularly notorious for this. And how those biphasic effects change based on one puff or two puffs or five puffs, like there's dose dependent effects, there's all the polypharmacy, and then of course there's the individual variability just at the physiological level. Beyond our ability to systematically describe how we're feeling, we've all got different levels of CB1 receptors. We've all got different levels of floating endogenous cannabinoids, that are
Mm-hmm.
running around in our brain. And those things also change with time and lifestyle factors, right? So if I had acupuncture today, I'm going to respond totally differently to the same joint that I smoked yesterday. So there's a lot of individual variability in our own physiology. There's, of course, the plant's ability to produce wildly different molecules, dose-dependent polypharmacy. It's just a very complex problem.
So is Indica Sativa hybrid the right paradigm, the right road we should be traveling on to define these experiences?
Well, in a way, yes, because it's what we have, right? We know the scientific literature tells us that there is no such thing botanically or genetically as indica sativa or hybrid, because everything is a hybrid. All that stuff goes out the window. So when we're using those terms, what we're really using them for is trajectory setting. This is what I would like to set up for myself. And it is useful in a way because cannabis is rather similar to a classic serotonergic psychedelic in that your intent matters, right? Setting and substance is the kind of psychedelic, rule of thumb. And that's also true when you're using cannabis. So if you're using this product mindfully, intending to go to sleep, So long as you stay in the therapeutic window, right? You take enough to feel something, but you don't take so much that you start feeling bad. As long as you stay in that sweet spot, it's highly probable that you can set yourself up for the experience you're expecting. So yeah, in some ways, if you put sleep on the side of a vape pen, maybe that helps. It also, I think, can be misleading because there's no evidence to suggest that your vape pen is actually inducing sleep. Right, exactly. But, that's also the beauty, right? That we have so much cognitive power to set ourselves up for an experience that the substance itself is secondary. It's really just about the interaction and empowering our own selves to create our own experiences.
Well, lastly, Dr. Rae, how do you envision the future of cannabis research, considering the growing importance of aroma when it comes to quality?
Yes, I think that the research component is a little more straightforward than the market component, right? It kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. The evidence is not a problem, provided that we can, scrape together enough funding to systematize aroma. It's probably going to go very similar to what we've seen in hops. So, for example, harvest timing. What happens to ideal timed, cannabis aroma versus early harvest and late harvest? Mm-hmm. With hops, we know that early harvest smells like hay. Ideal harvest smells like tropical fruit. Late harvest smells like onion, garlic, right? Probably we might find something quite similar with cannabis and hemp. So we could expect all those similar kinds of findings that we see with harvest timing, with curing conditions. We have to run systematic trials, the same harvest, the same plant, early, ideal, and late harvest. And then, we have replicates and a bunch of different drying conditions. What happens if you don't drop the humidity enough, or you don't drop the humidity fast enough, or the temperature is too high? Right? We'll see exactly what happens, not only to the volatile chemistry, but what happens to the aroma when you handle the product properly versus when it's mishandled, when you store the product properly versus when it's not stored properly. So we'll see all of that. And like I said, provided we get some funding to actually do that work, the evidence will speak for itself. The much greater challenge is going to be convincing the consumer that THC is irrelevant and you should just trust your body. Trust your body that your nose truly does know what to buy. That's going to be, as a scientist, I only really have, very few mechanisms for communicating these results. The papers themselves, my little social media following, talking to wonderful humans like you, Jeff. But to some extent, every consumer has to make their own decision about, what is valuable to them. And if the supply chain doesn't meet their demands, they have the most power to say, hey, everything in this dispensary smells the same and it all has 30% THC. I want more variety. And then, of course, it takes a leap of faith on the cultivator's behalf to say, okay, I can give you a great smelling flower, but it's only got 17% THC, right? And right now, that is a huge risk. Huge risk for someone to purposely set aside a part of their garden, knowing they're going to potentially lose money when they're already bleeding money, right? So it's a complex problem, shifting the entire market away from thinking about potency as the same thing as quality, which it isn't, and getting the entire supply chain thinking about aroma as the primary criterion for quality, which it is.
Dr. Rae, thank you so much for being a guest on The Fields. You have literally blown my mind wide open. I'm going to have to go back and triple check the reading and the study. I really appreciate you doing this for me. Thank you for taking your time out of your very busy schedule to be on The Fields.
Yes, it is such a privilege to share all of this knowledge with your audience. Thank you so much for the invitation, Jeff.
That's going to do it for another episode of The Fields. I'd like to thank our sponsor for this episode, 314 Garden Supply in Florissant, Missouri. Discover your green thumb at 314 Garden Supply. I'd also like to thank our clothing sponsor, Humble Rain. Be fiercely driven. Importantly, I'd like to thank our guest, Adie Rae, Assistant Scientist at Legacy Research Institute in Portland, Oregon. Finally, I'd like to thank you, the viewers and listeners around the globe. I'm Jeff Rouse. Until next time, have a great night.